if you really want to cut off your nose to spite your face, you really, really want to get rid of immigrants, then all you need is a depression.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and today our show is about some of the things that Trump is doing and some of the far right has been talking about doing around birthright citizenship, attack on immigrants, and some of the history around this. It's really an attack on the Constitution of the United States. Is something that's been going on for centuries and centuries, but it's also a huge step backwards. So our guest today is Masao Suzuki, and Masao is the grandson of an unauthorized immigrant from Japan. He's a longtime activist in the San Jose Japanese American community. He recently retired from teaching economics at Skyline College, and has written articles on economic history of immigration, such as Important or Impotent, taking another look at California anti-alien land law. He also has written a commentary recently for the Fight Back News service, and many of you may recognize him because he was a recent guest on Fight Back Radio, where he spoke. We tapped him for his knowledge of economics, and he spoke about inflation and Trump and the working class was the title of the episode. So if you haven't heard that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that one as well. So welcome back to Fight Back Radio, Masao.
Thank you, Richard. Good to be back.
Yeah. So what you want to kick us off here about talking about a little bit about what this birthright citizenship is and what Trump's doing?
Sure. Let me just explain. I was the one who wanted to try and use a PowerPoint presentation that I've already developed around the issue of birthright citizenship, because it's been around for a while, and we'll see how it goes. And I'm wearing another hat. I have many of them, but obviously last time I was doing my economics professor, and now I'm doing my sort of economic historian hat, because even though the issue is a legal one, but it has a lot of economic importance, because citizenship matters in terms of your economic opportunity. By the way, it should be clear to people, but the photo, hopefully, that you're seeing, the still photo, is a photo of Kim Ark-Wong, using the American way of putting the first name first and the surname last. And a lot of the question of birthright citizenship revolves around him. And so that's why his picture is featured. Let's see.
Before we jump into it, let me just say that, sure. So for those of you that are watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see the PowerPoint. I realized most people are listening on are just listening on Fight Back Radio, but if you wish to see the actual visuals that go along, and it should be fine for either way, but for those who wish to see the visuals, you can find Fight Back Radio on YouTube as well. So go ahead, Masao.
All right, let's see. So this whole issue of birthright citizenship, of course, has come up because President-elect Trump has said that he's going to abolish it. It's one of the things he claims he's going to do on the first day. And so one of the things about Trump is he has really a hard time accepting that African and Asians and Latinos are in fact citizens of the United States. So going back a few years, he was one of those right-wing birthers that questioned President Obama's citizenship. For those of you folks who don't remember President Obama, he's starting to be history. He was born in Hawaii, And so he is a native-born citizen of the United States. He also questioned Kamala Harris's citizenship in back in 2020 when she first ran for president and then became Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate. And so one of the things, I don't know if any of you remember, there's sort of a bizarre thing about, Kamala's always presented herself as Asian and not as Black. And I sort of, where is he going with that? Because he really hasn't. I know, I've known of Kamala Harris for a long time. She's from here in the Bay Area. In fact, she grew up about a mile from where I grew up in Berkeley, California. I happened to have her father, Professor Harris, as a professor at Stanford University when I went to grad school. And, in the main, she presented herself as Black, more so than Asian, in my opinion. And so I don't know where Trump was coming with this, but I'm thinking that maybe part of it is because one of the stereotypes about Asian Americans has been, and also with Latino Americans, that they're not really American, right? And that's not the stereotype of African Americans. They have a lot of other terrible stereotypes, but it's not that they're foreigners are not American.
So I know you're going to get into the details of this in your presentation here, but the basics of this, a birthright, is that that if you're born in the United States, then you're a citizen. And a lot of this stuff that Trump's raised that you talked about with Kamala Harris and Barack Obama, played to a really, hardcore racist base that was, I think that what you're saying. And, but yeah, I mean, it's the thing of, for centuries, literally, it's if you're born here, you're a citizen. So anyways, I'll let you go on.
No. I'll come back to that. So anyway, President-elect Trump, both in the 2016 and 2024, and I don't actually remember, but I assume in 2022, 2020 also, called for the deportation of all undocumented immigrants and their children. And so this is related to his view that he wants to end citizenship by birth, because then it would make the children of the undocumented not citizens, and therefore much easier to deport. And this is, he still, and his future administration still wants to do this, and that's why his border czar Holman, his proposed border czar, is very clear about that. No, we're not separating children from their parents. We're going to just deport them all this time around. And so this is, it's sort of connected with this, view. And this issue has been around for a while. He's not the only presidential candidate to attack the right for citizenship. In 2016, presidential candidate Ben Carson and Scott Walker and Rand Paul also opposed the right to citizenship. And you may not remember all those names, but that's okay. And there's even going a little further back, there's a local infamous character, the sheriff in Arizona, who is also a state legislature. I'm sorry, he's not the sheriff. He was a state legislator. I'm confusing him with another anti-immigrant figure from Arizona. And he passed a bill called SB 1070, that basically would criminalize the undocumented on a state level, and it led to a lot of protest and calls to boycott Arizona. And eventually, while it was passed on the state level, it was overruled by the uh, uh, Supreme Court on the grounds that the immigration and naturalization matters are the sole area of the federal government. So states don't have the right to control immigration or naturalization.
I mean, it strikes me that some of this is just, as the margins of the white majority in the United States get thinner, that it's an attempt to, restricting voting, but also, the population of the United States now and with children even into the future to try to preserve this majority white situation, so that there's not, you don't have a voting blocks of oppressed nationality peoples that could potentially vote for equal rights or equality or things like that.
Right. So I think that both Arizona and Texas, where you find a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment, that they're actually about 40% oppressed nationality, that is African American, Chicano, Mexicano, Latino, and Asian American, and Native American. And so I'm pretty sure in Arizona, there's sort of this fear of turning into California, because actually a lot of people don't know or don't remember, but back in the 1980s and 1990s, California was the center of the anti-immigrant movement. And there's a long history in that, even going back to the 1870s with the anti-Chinese movement. It was centered actually in San Francisco. But that, of course, changed with in part because of the changing demographics of California. In fact, back in the 1980s, there was a proposition, I think it was 186, that would have required, for example, school teachers to report if their students' parents were undocumented. They had to report to immigration. Then it was the INS, still La Migra, and it was actually passed by about 60% vote here in California. But again, most of the provisions were tossed out by the Supreme Court. Also, again, in the 90s, it was in the platform of the Republican Party. The difference being is they called for a constitutional amendment to end birthright citizenship, which is the proper way to go. Why do I say that? Because really it's written in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And so this is the real target of it. Trump personally, really, he's sworn to uphold the Constitution, but he doesn't care. He's going to swear that on inauguration, and then he says on day one he's going to be a dictator, which isn't in the Constitution. It's like, oh, the president gets to be dictator for a day. No, that's nowhere in the Constitution. And so what does the 14th Amendment say? It starts with this section 1 that all persons, all, born or naturalized in the United States, so it includes people who've gone through a naturalization process, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and, very importantly, of the state wherein they reside. So if you're a citizen, according to the federal government, the states have to recognize that. And so this is part of the attempts. This was a post-Civil War 1868 constitutional amendment that was, part of the effort to rein in the states' rights viewpoints of the Confederates, of the slave owners. And so you can't have a separate citizenship requirement than the federal government.
So because it's the 14th Amendment that says if you're born or naturalized in the United States, then you're a citizen. Because of that, it's not so easy for ALEC or whatever, some of these right-wing things, organizations to go in different states, or even now that they control the federal government and the Supreme Court. It's not so easy just to say, okay, we're going to pass a new law and knock these people out. And so it has to go through a process of changing the amendment or changing the interpretation of the amendment, it seems.
Well, that's the proper way to do things. But as we, realized, as we saw in Trump's first term as president, he's really not about following proper procedure at all, which was actually to his detriment, because a number of his efforts to do things, mainly bad things in my view, were stymied, were blocked, were not able to happen because he didn't go through the proper procedures. Okay. So the constitutional amendment would be a proper procedure. Now, constitutional amendments are very difficult to do, and this was something very clear on the intentions of the so-called founding fathers. Now, I don't know if I've ever quoted the founding fathers before, because I'm not. They have different sides. Many of them were slave owners or profited from slavery, but it was very clear that they wanted, because the Constitution is the fundamental legal document of the United States, they wanted to make it hard to change the rules sort of the game. And so in order to get a constitutional amendment, it has to pass 2/3 of the House and Senate. And then, and this is the real kicker, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, or 38 states have to ratify it. And so that means only 13 states can block any constitutional amendment. And I'm pretty sure there's at least 13 states that would never go for this. So a lot of what's happening is there's efforts to try and reinterpret and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, because this other thing's all person born. Well, it's pretty clear if you're born or not, right? Or naturalized. Our citizens.
I don't know. Trump was with Obama was making the case that he wasn't born in Hawaii. I think he was saying you might have been born in Africa or whatever.
I mean, that's the case of, it's not a legal case, it's a reality case.
Right. That's right. That's right.
That is very common. And unfortunately, in my view, it really started with the tobacco companies, who their own scientists told them back in the 50s and 60s that cigarettes were harmful to people's health. And yet their CEOs were going before Congress under oath, i.e. that they committed perjury, saying, oh no, we don't know anything about negative health effects. And so it's gone from denying the reality of cigarette health issues to denying climate change, which President-elect Trump is one of those climate change deniers. And, it's sort of like, well, who are you going to believe? Your lying eyes or, these right-wing climate change deniers. And unfortunately, it's gone from climate change and it's spilled over into, vaccine skepticism. And now we have, what's his name, R.F. Kennedy Jr., being proposed to lead the Health and Human Services, and he's a vaccine skeptic, and it's absolutely crazy. But that's the thing, is if you have an alternative, I don't know how many of your followers have seen any of the Marvel, they have these alternative universes, which allows them to sort of patch in anything they want. But, that's sort of science fiction, and it's not reality. But anyway, let's get back to what I'm talking about. Oh, what am I? Uh-oh, now I'm having a problem here. There we go. So the 14th Amendment was passed back in 1868, and there were calls during World War II when Japanese Americans were rounded up and put into concentration camps. 2/3 of them were native-born U.S. citizens, and only 1/3 were immigrants who were banned by law. By the law at that time was no Asians could naturalize. So Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, South Asians were all banned from naturalizing. And there was a couple of interesting court cases. South Asian immigrant went to court and says, well, all the books say that Indians are actually Aryan, like Europeans, and so I should be allowed to become a U.S. citizen. And the court said, basically, we know a white person when we see one, and we don't care about what the history books say, that you're not white. And then the actually, and this is an interesting case, the Armenians, who Armenia, your geography, now you'll know, is in Asia, right? And so a lot of Armenians came about 100 years ago. Many of them settled in California. We even had a Armenian American governor here. And so the problem was that the law says that Asiatics, which commonly means people from Asia, can't become U.S. citizens. And so they went to court, and actually the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, I should say, not the U.S., but the California Supreme Court ruled that Armenians are white, basically because, it's, I guess, sorry, there was a famous statement once about, well, what's how can you ban pornography? What is it? And it's like, well, I know it when I see it. And so it's sort of like that. It goes up to the Supreme Court of California. We know a white person when we see one. So
it's incredible.
Basically rule that Armenian Americans are not Asians, even though Armenia is an Asian. Okay.
Let me circle back a little bit here to the Japanese. So the people, since they didn't allow citizenship this was for over a long period of time, and so if 2/3 of the people that went into the camps that they were rounded up and sent into during World War II were citizens, that tells me these are not just citizens, but people that had been in generations, most likely that they had been here, those 2/3 anyways, because citizenship wasn't granted recently.
Yeah, the vast majority of Japanese, because their immigration really peaked in the first decade of the 20th century. So the vast majority of the American-born were second generation. They were the children of immigrants. And there was a few third generation people, but very few, and they were like babies for the most part.
Okay.
And I think the push behind stripping them of citizenship is there were people who wanted to deport all of the Japanese Americans. And so it's one thing to put people into camp, but it would be another thing to deport, U.S. Citizenship, because they could, they did go to court about the camps, and the Supreme Court at the time took a pass and said, well, there's a war on, so we're going to pass on this. But if you want to do a mass deportation, it's quite another thing.
Yeah. Well, and especially if somebody's a U.S. citizen, there's a question of where you deport them to even.
Yeah. Well, and then technically there are ways to denaturalize someone to strip them of citizenship, but for a native born citizen, I've never even heard of it. To me, it would have to be something having to do with treason or, you know what I mean? Yeah, you
Yep.
prove yourself that you're.
Well, I think as you're about to tell us, Trump might have some ideas too, so we may find out in the coming months. But yes.
Uh, So the biggest challenge to the 14th Amendment came from the anti-Chinese movement. As I said before, it was centered in San Francisco a lot more than 100 years ago. It's closer to 150 years ago when it first developed. And this anti-Chinese movement wasn't only a legal movement, there was discriminatory laws like one of the things is there's a long history of what are called restrictive covenants, which are clauses in the original deed for a home that says no person of color can live in this home. And in fact, when my wife and I were looking to buy a home, one of the homes, they had all of the original documents, and the home was built around 1948, so before the civil rights movement. And in the original deed to the house was that restrictive covenants that no person that's not white could reside in this home. And interestingly enough, there was an exception, which I found later was very common. It said, unless they're a domestic servant. So it's really not about keeping the neighborhood, not about having no non-white people in the neighborhood. It was no, you don't want any non-white homeowners, but domestic servants are fine.
Yeah.
But that started in San Francisco, aimed at the Chinese, and then it spread to the rest of the country where it was mainly used against African Americans, right? So this is one of the themes, I think is very important, is that the racist laws that affect and practices like lynching, unfortunately, that affect one oppressed nationality will spill over and affect other ones, right? And so this racist law to restrict home ownership by non-whites was mainly targeted against Chinese originally because of the anti-Chinese movement, and it meant to bottle up the Chinese in Chinatown. And not only SF Chinatown, but there were actually a lot of Chinatowns throughout the West. At one point, Chinese made up a quarter of the whole labor force in the Western states. It was the overall population was very small, but you looked at agricultural labor, railroad labor, mining, and then a lot of domestic labor because the population in the West early on, or at least the European population, was predominantly male. And so Chinese slipped into a lot of what were considered women work. They were cooks. They did, laundry, the stereotype of the Chinese laundromat was, there's a basis in reality. A lot of laundries in the 19th century or the 1800s in the West were owned by Chinese. And you had a lot of single guys who didn't know or didn't want to wash their clothes. So they had the Chinese do it. Oh, and this is going way back, but it's even in the common culture. If any of you ever watched, I'm showing my age, the Western TV series of Bonanza, they had a Chinese cook. And that was, it was a domestic servant, but that was also real at that time. And so speaking of spillovers, usually with lynching and mass violence, it's associated against African Americans, and that's definitely true. But it actually, a lot of it originated with the treatment of Native Americans, and it spilled over into treatment of Chinese Americans. So the graphic here is a depiction of the 1885 massacre of Chinese American miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming. And again, a lot of the mining early on were Chinese Americans. And maybe I'll put a drop in here for 19th century anarchists. And so they actually played a big role, unlike today's anarchists, in my view. Anarchists played a big role in the labor movement back in the 19th century and even the early years of the 20th century. The leaders of the great, I think it was in 1886, you probably know this better, this strike for an 8-hour day, right?
Yes, Haymarket Square in
Haymarket.
Chicago, of course. Yes.
The leaders were mainly immigrant anarcho-syndicalists, anarchists, but they believed in building militant class struggle unions. The two labor organizers who were martyred, framed up and executed, Sacco and Vanzetti, again, Italian immigrants, labor organizers. And so the IWW, International Workers of the World, or Industrial Workers of the World. I'm sorry, you should correct me.
No, it's right. Industrial Workers of the World.
Yeah,
but workers. Yeah.
IWW. So one of the good things about them is they were the only labor group who organized Chinese American workers in the West. They were like, we're going to organize all the workers, irregardless of race or ethnicity. So this anti-Chinese movement, it was centered in San Francisco, but it was very widespread. And there were a lot of state and local laws, like these restrictive covenants. There was segregation of Chinese American students in the schools in San Francisco and other places, ultimately led to the Chinese Exclusion Act that barred most immigration from China. And I shouldn't say most, it should say almost all, because the only legal exceptions were for merchants, ministers, some professionals, doctors, etc. And so this was the first major limitation on immigration. Before that, it was pretty much, well, they could check you. They were supposed to check you for tuberculosis. And there was an earlier law, just a few years earlier in 1875, that you weren't supposed to be a prostitute. Although it was legal in many places in the United States. In fact, I know from studying the old, my historian side, old census records, one of the occupations listed was, prostitute, right? But anyway, this was the first one, and also the first one that explicitly banned a whole nationality from entering the U.S. So Wong Kim Ark. He was born to Chinese immigrant parents around 1870. Now, this was, there weren't a lot of American-born Chinese because the immigration, it's a common thing with immigration. It usually tends to be more or less predominantly male, especially historically. And the major exception to that, I think, were in the 19th century, were the Irish, where a lot of Irish women came over. And that's perhaps because a lot of them were actually, economic refugees out of the Irish potato famine and also the effects of British colonialism, because it was a British colony. But for most of them, and the Chinese, the vast majority, were just male. And so there weren't that many American-born kids. But anyway, he was born around 1870. Why was it around 1870? Well, he wasn't born in a hospital, and he didn't have a birth certificate. So it was very common back then. I even have a aunt who didn't have a birth certificate, and so she had to use a entry in the family Bible to show her birth date. So he went. His parents ended up moving back to China, and he traveled there twice as a young man. And the first time there wasn't a problem, but the second time he was denied entry on the grounds that the Chinese Exclusion Act banned immigrants from China. And they said, well, you're coming from China and you're Chinese, so therefore you can't come in. And he said, no, I'm not. I'm a native-born citizen of the United States. And so
this goes right to the heart of this 14th Amendment
right,
that you've
and
been
that's why
talking
this
about.
case is very important, because there's the wording in the constitutional amendment, but then there's also a Supreme Court case on it, which is very definitive. And so he got the support of the local Chinese American community. And so the Chinese American community actually participated. There are a lot of business leaders and professionals and so forth. They participated in a lot of court cases. So, for example, how do we know that the restrictive covenants started in San Francisco? Well, that's because where the earliest court cases were, there were lawsuits against the law saying that it was unconstitutional. Again, there's another part of the 14th Amendment, which is the due process section. So they actually used that, but it didn't work in that case because I think it was influenced by the whole separate but equal doctrine. So it's like, well, it's not saying, and basically it was also argued on the fact that it wasn't a government law. It was basically the owners or the builders, free contract of he could sell who he wanted to, and he didn't want to sell to any Chinese. Well, that's his right. So anyway, he fought the case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it took a while. Let's see. When was 1894? Well, it took 4 years. That's not too long as court cases go. And in 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-2 in Wong versus the U.S. that Kim Ark Wong was a citizen by virtue of birth. And I know, a lot of us nowadays have sort of mixed opinions about the Supreme Court, especially in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There's definitely, the right wing used to criticize courts for being activists, and they're definitely activists now. But this is a little different because the thing about the right to abortion, it was basically established in a Supreme Court decision. It's not actually written explicitly into the Constitution as this was. And so this is important because you have the wording of the amendment, and then there's the court clarified what does it mean to be under the jurisdiction of the U.S. And they said that the only exceptions would be the children of diplomats, because diplomats have what's called extraterritoriality, and that they're not subject to the U.S. Jurisdiction. They can be tossed out of the country, but they can't actually be prosecuted for crimes here in the U.S. Now, of course, most diplomats are basically here to make a good impression on their country, or to spy, to be honest. But even if you spy, which is it's actually a capital offense here, but they can't be tried if they're diplomatic personnel. They're just tossed out of the country. They're told.
So these are like people that work in consulates or in embassies that are from foreign countries that are here to do whatever, to promote trade or to whatever, to spy, as you said, but also to talk, whatever, to put forward the view of their country to whoever they think they need to here in the United States.
And it would be foreign government personnel, because there's a lot of, they don't totally staff it with their own, nationality. They do generally hire some Americans just to make the thing, work. So my dad actually worked for the Japanese consulate. He was basically, called himself a tea boy. He brought tea to everyone who came in, and then he smoked it. And my dad's bilingual, and so he just figured his sole task was figure out whether they're Japanese speaking or English speaking. The best job he had before World War II, because when he came back over here, he was born here, raised in Japan, and then he came back over here basically to escape the Japanese draft. Which a lot of people did, actually. My father-in-law actually did the same thing, because Japan by that time was mired in a decade-long war in China. Right. Anyway, when he first came over here, his jobs here on the West Coast were he worked in a produce market, he worked as a houseboy doing domestic work, and he worked in the fields gleaning cotton, so following machines, which weren't that effective at the time. It was early on, and then they would. It was a job where you sort of follow the machines and you pick up all the cotton they miss, and all of those. They're traditional sort of pre-World War II Asian American jobs in the fields, in the house, or doing some kind of food. In a restaurant or produce market or whatever. And he heard of this opening in the Japanese embassy. He was in art school at the time, and he moved out to Washington, D.C. Now, unfortunately for him, that was like in September of 1941. So it only lasted a couple of months, and then he got tossed into jail. And it was detained. All the consular staff was detained, and then almost all of them went back to Japan. He stayed. Okay. He left Japan. He's like, I'm not going back. Anyway, so they're not subject to U.S. jurisdiction. And then the other one are children of a foreign occupation army. And they're really, there's been only one instance of a foreign occupation army in the U.S., which was when the British invaded in 1812, but they didn't really bring along, women.
Not too many kids, huh?
But this goes back, and this is where this idea is really it's an old English idea, which these MAGA types don't seem to appreciate. Old English tradition when it doesn't suit them, but it's based on English common law that was used by the colonies even before independence from Britain. And the reason is England has been invaded many times by many people, right? Starting at least, I'm not a big British history, but of course the Romans invaded Britain. And then the Anglos and the Saxons, they were Germanic tribes, invaded England, and then the Vikings. And I think this is probably the origins, was the Viking invasions, and the Danes invaded England. And then finally, of course, the Normans, which are sort of the French assimilated Vikings from Normandy, invaded and conquered England in 1066. So there's a long history of foreign invasions in England, and that's why they had this clause. But it's very clear that foreign armies are not subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. You can't go arrest them.
But I mean, it seems what's interesting about this to me is that it seems that this birthright citizenship thing, that if you're born in a country, you're a citizen of the country. goes back, even older than the United States of America. It's a centuries old idea that was adopted by the United States, whatever, for, black people were in a separate situation because they were slaves,
Right.
and were treated horribly, of course. But for everybody else, that this idea was in place, for a long time, and so that's interesting. And also, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court in the late 19th century, even once the 14th Amendment was passed, it underlined it and said, yeah, we're gonna, this is this stands up to whatever scrutiny they were given in the case that you cited.
Right. And that background is important because the 14th Amendment was one of three post-Civil War constitutional amendments. So the 13th Amendment was passed first, that it abolished slavery. So slavery or involuntary servitude is illegal according to the Constitution in the United States. Then the 14th Amendment, which isn't only establishing citizenship, but also things like due process. And then the 15th Amendment banned the use of race to limit voting rights. So these were three amendments. And the reason why the 14th Amendment had to establish citizenship rights for African Americans is because of an earlier Supreme Court case, 1857 Dred Scott case, where basically the 14th Amendment was designed to overturn the Supreme Court's decision. So you can overturn a Supreme Court's decision by constitutional amendment. And so Dred Scott, who's pictured here, or it's a photo of,
If you're on YouTube, yes,
is a slave born about 1800. And again, they didn't keep records. And he actually ended up working or being owned in Minnesota, actually by a doctor at a fort right outside of Minneapolis. And I went to the fort, and they actually have a little, this is the doctor's office where they own Dred Scott and stuff like that. And so he was allowed to marry. He had lived in the Free State, Minnesota. He was rented out to work, which other slaves were rented out, but it wasn't the typical practice. The typical practice is where slaves were owned and either did farm work on a plantation, or they did domestic work on a plantation or otherwise. And it was the only ones who were rented out usually had some kind of skills that were needed. And this is a situation in the South, because the South historically, up until recently, has had relatively less immigration. And so we're often lacking in the skilled trades because, anyway. And so he sued for his freedom because his owner refused to let him buy his own freedom, which some slave owners did, but it was a small minority of slave owners. And after a long legal battle that involved both state and federal courts, he ended up before the U.S. Supreme Court that ruled for Dred Scott's owner, Mrs. Sanford. And so the Supreme Court ruled, this was in, I think, 1859, 7-2, stated that African slaves and their descendants could never be U.S. citizens and did not have any protection of the Constitution. And this really empowered the Southern slave owners who were, because basically what it did was it opened up everywhere in the U.S. to slave catchers. And, they would snatch random black people saying they were slaves. And it's sort of, how do you prove you're not a slave? And it's also galvanized the anti-slavery movement because it basically meant the South, or the slave owners, had won, and they were going to impose their values on the entire United States. And so this was a key battle leading up to the Civil War. And so, what was I going to say? So, yeah, so this right to citizenship overturned the Dred Scott decision. It made African Americans U.S. citizens. And it was interesting. One of the things, I don't have it down here, that was in the discussion in Congress, one of the Congress people or senators, I don't remember, said, "Oh, well, are you saying that some Chinaman born here can be a U.S. citizen?" And the response was, yes. That's why we're saying all persons. We mean all persons. And so this birthright citizenship was really rooted in the struggle to gain equality for African Americans. It was fought for by Asian Americans, by Chinese Americans, and it was later cited in the 1982, most recently Plyler versus Doe, where the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a Texas state law that tried to exclude unauthorized Mexican immigrant children from the public schools. Now, they said that they cited this, but the main reason they said the U.S. government has an overwhelming interest in educating everyone in the U.S. There's no gain for the U.S. to have a large class of uneducated, illiterate people here. And so this connection, both on the negative side, how a racist law, racist acts like lynching can spill over to other nationalities. Or here in California, we had an anti-miscegenation law that banned whites and non-whites from marrying. So a lot of Japanese immigrants, well, not a lot, but the few Japanese immigrants who wanted to marry someone who wasn't Japanese or Chinese often had to go to other states to get married because of the anti-miscegenation laws here. So again, those laws were first aimed at African Americans, but they applied to Asian Americans also. And then the fight against these racist laws and discrimination, also the fight of one nationality can benefit other nationalities. So the struggle of African Americans and others, to defeat the slave-owning Confederacy and to pass these civil rights acts to the Constitution benefited later Asian Americans, and today mainly Chicanos and Latinos. And so these fights also, they start with one nationality, but they end up benefiting basically everyone. And more recently, of course, the Civil Rights Act. In fact, modern Asian America, as we know it today, wouldn't exist without the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, and then the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, because prior to that, there were these racist, nationality quotas. And so I think Japanese had an immigration quota of 200 people a year, right? And Chinese also. And so back in 1970, actually consistently from about 1930 all the way up to 1970, Japanese Americans were the biggest Asian American group. And then second were Chinese. Then third was Filipino, very few Korean Americans, and then basically nobody else. And so Asian America, of course, is very different today, where Chinese, Filipinos, and Indian Americans are the largest groups. And I can't remember the latest statistics, but Koreans and Vietnamese may even be larger than Japanese Americans. So we've gone from the biggest Asian American group down to like number 6. And it's not because there's fewer Japanese Americans. It's just that there's very few Japanese who are immigrating to the United States these days, whereas there's a lot of Chinese and Indians and Filipinos and Vietnamese that are immigrating.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because it's like, the story you describe here from U.S. history is that the Dred Scott decision was an overreach. I think, and that's why it led to war. And because they wanted to, there was a debate amongst the ruling class about the expansion of slavery, and Dred Scott basically said, yes, slavery not only can expand, it can dominate, and that led to war. And the victors in the war were of course the North, and that side then used these amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, to give black people, but not only black people, others, all these rights, and especially you see the Chinese, especially made sure that they applied to them and were solidified at the end of the 19th century. And today we see a rolling back. Obviously there was a rolling back. It was been back and forth throughout history. We had Jim Crow that affected black people and all kinds of other stuff. But this rolling back of voting rights that we see now, and the attacks on the 14th Amendment are they'll affect, no doubt, they'll affect Asians and black people, but they're geared initially primarily at Latinos and people from Central America and South America and Mexico. So I mean, it's interesting to me that what you said is true. I think that what effect the national oppression of each group has its own characteristics, but they're intertwined. And the people that try to, it's various forms of having different rights, similar to apartheid, where you can exploit people that way.
And that's where I think also it's, when Trump and his followers talking about making America great again, they're thinking really back to around 1900 or even earlier, maybe somewhere between 1877 and the end of Reconstruction and around, I guess, 1890, 1900 or so. And so, the thing is, America was a growing, leading world imperial power. It had taken over the Philippines and made a semi-colony of Panama and Cuba. A lot of times there's Trump made a statement about, oh, we're going to take back the Panama Canal. Well, actually, I haven't seen any commentary. The fact of the matter is the U.S. was trying to negotiate a canal with Colombia, and Colombia wasn't giving the U.S. what it wanted. So the U.S. instigated a revolt because Panama used to be part of Colombia. So it instigated a revolt there, and then the new government of Panama turned around and signed an agreement with the United States. And so it's just another example of the U.S. interfering, and in this case, splitting. The U.S. has a long history of, and they got it from the British too, but imperial countries have a long history of splitting up weaker countries to their benefit. And so anyway, I think that's why he's talking about, Panama and Canada and Greenland. And, he's talking like a 1900s, 1900, American imperialist. And he wants to go back there. Some of his stuff about, tariffs replacing income taxes. Well, it's true. In 1900, tariffs provided the vast bulk of the federal government tax revenues. Now, of course, the thing you don't realize is that at that time, the U.S. didn't have a big standing army, right? And we didn't have any foreign military bases. So, if you want to shrink the government, because the vast majority of U.S. federal government spending that's not Medicare and Social Security, which have their own dedicated taxes. You can have, all of you who are working can see it on your paycheck. There's a Social Security deduction and a Medicare deduction. But the income tax that people pay, that's you're going to wrap it up by December 31st, I guess. And it's due by April 15th. Most of that goes to the military and veteran spending. And so if you really want to shrink the government, you have to really shrink that. Of course, he's not going to. That's the contradiction, is you can't have it both ways. And that's a lot of what Trump, he claims about he talked about making America affordable again, and then he wants to raise tariffs. Well, tariffs are a type of taxes on goods. And, what happens when you put a tax on goods? Well, the price goes up, right? So,
Yep, absolutely.
There's a lot of contradictions.
So, Masao, I wanted to ask you also, there's been a bit of a fight within the Republican ranks with Elon Musk and this guy, Vivek Ramaswamy, who have said, look, we need these people that are highly skilled to come over and help our tech industry. I remember Bill Gates has said this much earlier as well. And the hardcore racists at the base of the MAGA grouping have pushed back and said, no, we don't want any immigrants here. We don't want any people, especially people of color. And I see today that as we're recording this, that Trump has also weighed in and said, on the side of the billionaires, surprise, surprise. Saying I love visas. Visas are great. H-1B visa, I use them all the time. Blah 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 in my hotels, etc. So I mean, it seems that this is a potential split in that grouping and a split amongst rulers of this country as well, because there's people, immigrant worker people, rich people are making money off of immigrant workers everywhere. And it's not just the highly skilled, the agricultural businesses are making money by paying very low wages to unskilled workers who are picking, like your father did, picking crops in the field and such like that. So it seems like this is a potential split in the Republican Party, and certainly a split amongst the ruling class of this country.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I wouldn't quite call it a split. I'd say there's a definite division, and it's funny because it's not that I agree with the MAGA hardcore. But there's this stereotype or this argument that immigrants, undocumented in particular, but immigrants in general, will take jobs from native-born U.S. Americans. And in fact, in general, that is not true. And in fact, immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, are really concentrated in a lot of jobs that most of us, I'm assuming you were born here, Richard, but I don't actually know.
Yes, I was. Okay. I was born in Wisconsin.
But I should just speak for myself, that I wouldn't want to take, so agricultural field work. There's a lot of immigrants here in the Bay Area, elder care. A lot of immigrants, roofers nationwide, a lot of immigrants. And I haven't actually worked as a roofer. And I've never done field work, seriously, but I've done my own, just personal elder care. Not fun, but, with my own parents. But roofing, I built a new pool shed in my backyard from scratch. And the worst part about it, even though it's like 6 by 8 feet, right? Roof, that's a teeny roof, but that was nasty work in the sun at an angle, smelly. And yeah, so anyway, but a lot of roofing. So these are, meat packing too. Like you're familiar with that 100 years ago, or maybe a little less, the Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle.
Sure,
right?
Of course, yes.
Meat packing, and it was basically Eastern and maybe a few Southern European workers it's my go-to if anyone asks me about how do I become a vegetarian. I'm like, well, read the John. But along
Yes.
the way. Um,
Well,
uh,
I notice also, though, I mean, with this, even with as these debates come about with, between the mega hardcore and the tech industry, that they're not talking so much about making people citizens. They're talking about visas, H-1B visas, and there's been challenges even to black people who have been here for centuries, making it more difficult for them to vote. And it's there's definitely trying to make it hard for poor people to vote. And so I think it goes back to, at the top of the program, I mentioned this idea of creating a wider, a wider berth for a white majority to vote. And you mentioned, especially probably in border states within the South or Southwest. But these are, at stake is real questions of power and rights and things like that.
I mean, what was I going to say? But getting back to the H-1B visas, which are mainly used by high-tech workers these days, is there are a number of cases where it's very clear that they are actually replacing American workers. And I don't know the backgrounds of the American workers, whether they're immigrants or native born or whatever, but there are definite cases of that. It comes up frequently, especially here in the Bay Area, where you have a group of workers who are doing IT, information technology jobs, and they basically they're told their job is being terminated, and then before they're out the door, they have to train a group of H-1B visas to do their job for obviously a lot less. And so that is one type, because it's a temporary worker visa, that I don't really personally support expansion of these temporary worker jobs. And I think they don't talk about it, but I think they're going to try to, as this deportation thing comes along, try to expand in other ways temporary worker visas for like agriculture and things like that, in order to offset the loss of the labor force. And so I don't think that, because you're basically establishing a whole group of people without rights. They're not slaves, but all you want is their labor, and you don't want to have them go to school. You don't want, blah 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 blah.
Right, right. I mean, it seems like we're going back to a time where it really calls for us as people of conscience to step up on behalf of the immigrants, and especially working class immigrants who have even less power than other classes. I know in 2006 we had the mega marches across the United States, here in Chicago and in California. I know there were these huge marches, especially Los Angeles, where they tried to deport people wholesale across the country. And Trump has promised that. He's using the military and other things, and I guess we'll see what happens. I know here in Chicago and in cities across the country on January 20th, we're going to be marching, against Trump's agenda. And I think this issue of immigrant rights and preserving the Fourteenth Amendment, I'm sorry, and the Civil War amendments will be at the center of this, and hopefully we'll get big turnouts across the country, and we can stop some of Trump's ideas and make it difficult for him to govern the way he wants to.
Yep, I certainly think so. And I mean, it's has to immigration. Trump has always railed at the Democrats, and there's some truth to this, about getting into these forever wars. Although we have to remember who got into who got us into Iraq and Afghanistan. It wasn't the Democrats. It was George Bush, right? And that the Afghanistan war was the longest war in U.S. history, like 20 years or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I think it was more than that. Yeah.
More than 20
So,
years and $1 trillion. So it was really a bipartisan thing. But part of the problem with Trump is, he's said in the past that, well, trade wars are good and easy to win. And that the problem, I mean, I don't think they're necessarily good, but that's his opinion. He has a right to opinion. But the thinking that they're easy to win is where he runs into reality that trade wars, it's sort of like the U.S. Military intervention. If you're intervening when the U.S. Tried to break the Vietnam syndrome by invading and overthrowing the government of Grenada with a population of 300,000, that was easy, right? It wasn't right, but it was easy. And same thing with if you put sanctions on a very small or economically weak country or one that's dependent on the U.S., you can apply a lot of leverage. But he's taking on major countries, Mexico and Canada, and then even bigger economies, China and the EU. And because he thinks they're easy to win, I think he might think it's easy if I want to take over the Panama Canal, or it'll be easy to take over Greenland. It has a very small population. We'll just overrun it with our military. But that's all. I think we have to really oppose that because he'll get us into other wars. Oh, and his people. I don't know if Trump has actually said it. His people around him have talked about doing military strikes in Mexico.
So, unfortunately, we're running out of time here, Masao, and I want to give you an opportunity. If there's anything else you'd like to add at this point that we haven't covered here, or anything you want to say to our Fight Back Radio listeners before we end the program.
I think the last thing is that while I think Trump really believes he can get rid of birthright citizenship, I don't think he'll be able to. I think the legal obstacles are too great. But I do think the big danger is that he's going to carry out deportations. He's going to try and deport U.S. citizen children, or at least he'll be arresting them and rounding them up and put them in detention camps. And basically, do it enough to really strike fear into people. And, that can help some of his billionaire friends, or even not even billionaire, but smaller business people by, being able to pay less. So we'll see how many he actually deports. But I think he's going to create a lot of fear and hurt a lot of people, which is, that's their intention, is they want to create fear and hurt people and try and both persuade people not to come and even get people to leave. And they only, historically, there's only one way you can really get rid of a lot of immigrants, and that is if you have a depression. Because during the last, it wasn't called a depression, but it really sort of was the financial crisis in 2008 and 9. That's the first time we had a net outflow of undocumented immigrants. And then during the depths of the Great Depression in 30, 31, 32, we actually had an overall outflow of immigrants from the United States. And so, if you really want to cut off your nose to spite your face, you really, really want to get rid of immigrants, then all you need is a depression. Hopefully we won't see that, but
we'll end on that cheerful note. Well, thank you though for being our guest, and
Okay,
this was very informative. So thank you, Masao.
better or worse, I expect to be back.
All right. Thanks a lot, Masao.
Okay, no, thank you, Richard. And I really, I've been starting to follow your Fight Back Radio things religiously.
All
I
right. All
past it
right.
was hit or miss, but now it's like, no, I better listen or watch everyone. And
All
I
right.
encourage all your listeners to do the same, even if it's not me.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome to the resistance. Here we are. I mean, January 20th, Donald Trump is going to take office. There'll be a change in the president of the United States, and our conditions are going to change. As Masao has just pointed out, some of the things that the right wing is talking about, and some of the things, some of them they're going to do, I think. But one thing we know for sure, there's going to be harsh attacks on a broad group of people that'll include women, workers, African Americans, LGBTQ, and the environment. The drill baby drill bit is already, taken place, I think. You will continue the imperial wars of Biden, so I think that's something that we'll see similar, although there may be some changes in focus. And then I think we're going to see attacks on the working class across the board, trade unions, etc. And of course, there's going to be attacks on immigrant workers, and as Masao talked about. It's disturbing to me that the Civil War was fought, and that the amendments that were passed is the victory of that Civil War to end slavery are now being either, probably reinterpreted, maybe even repealed, but probably reinterpreted to attack immigrants and to deport immigrants. And I think this is an attack on the entire working class. I think you're seeing these division of rights, whether, the most extreme are apartheid kind of situations or Jim Crow kind of situations. But when one group of workers has a different set of rights or is threatened with deportation or don't have the same rights to vote or whatever it is, it weakens our entire class and allows rich people to manipulate us. And so we need to do something about that. And the start is January 20th. So people, I hope all our Fight Back Radio listeners are planning to go to a protest on January 20th. Here in Chicago, it'll be 11 a.m. at Federal Plaza. And whatever city you're in, the Federal Plaza is a good bet for where it might be. But if you're not sure, you can send an email to us at Fight Back Radio, and we'll tell you the closest one that we're aware of. So you can reach Fight Back Radio at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And also, I want to encourage our Fight Back Radio listeners to communicate with us. Tell us what you like or don't like. We tried, for those of you watching on YouTube, there was Professor Suzuki did a little bit of a PowerPoint kind of presentation. Do you like that? Should we do more of that kind of thing? Are there things we can do with the video to make it better, or things with the audio that can do it? There were some glitches, I know, in the last episode with the audio, and one of our listeners, sent something in and caught it right away, and so we've been working to try to fix that. Also, though, I want to say, if please. Like or subscribe, or depending on what platform you're listening to it on, tell other people about us, retweet, share. All these things help people find us, and we want to grow Fight Back Radio in the coming year. So we appreciate all of our listeners, and we've been growing at a good clip. We got well over 2,500 subscribers right now, and we're continuing to grow, and we appreciate that. But we want to. If we're going to make the change we want to make, we need to communicate with each other, and we try to bring experts from different movements here to talk to you. So hopefully you appreciate that as well. So finally, I want to thank the production team, which does a fabulous job as always. Natalie Pranis, Dodd McColgan, Shane Tremley, and Vince Olson. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people.